The manager was holding the credit card up between two fingers like it was something she'd found stuck to the bottom of her shoe, not handing it back, not running it, just holding it at eye level in the middle of a bright and quiet luxury boutique so that everyone near the counter could see her do it. A platinum card, heavy, matte, the kind the store's best customers carried. And she was holding it the way you hold a thing you have already decided is stolen. Standing on the other side of the counter was a black woman in her 50s, in a charcoal wool coat and low heels, her handbag on her arm, her expression very calm. She had come in on her day off to buy a gift. She had picked out a watch, a good one, and she had handed over her card to pay for it. And somewhere in the last 90 seconds, this had stopped being a purchase and started being an accusation. There was a police officer standing a few feet to her right now, thumbs hooked in his belt, listening to the manager and not to her. And there were two other customers by the display cases with their phones already half raised because everyone in that store could feel what was happening even if they couldn't yet name it. "Ma'am," the manager was saying in the loud, slow, patient voice people use when they want an audience to hear how reasonable they are. "This card is not going to work for you. I think we both know that. I've called the police and they're going to want to ask you some questions about where you got it." The woman in the charcoal coat did not raise her voice. She never did. She looked at the manager and then at the officer, and she said quietly, "I'd like you to run the card, that's all. Run it and show me it was declined." And that was the thing the manager would not do. She would accuse, she would announce, she would call the police. But she would not simply run the card, because some part of her already suspected what the machine would say. And she had decided, the moment this woman walked in, that a black woman buying a watch this expensive could only mean one thing. She was wrong about that. She was wrong in a way that was about to end her career, because the woman she had spent 10 minutes calling a thief in front of a store full of phones was not a thief. She was a justice of the state Supreme Court. And the cases that landed on her desk week after week were appeals about exactly this, about police officers and ordinary citizens, and the split-second assumptions that turn one into a suspect. The woman they were treating like a criminal was one of the highest-ranking judges in the entire state. They just didn't know it yet. Before we find out who the woman they called a thief really was, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let's dive back into the story. To understand what a mistake Rebecca Stroud was making, you have to understand who was actually standing at her counter. Her name was Denise Halloway. Justice Denise Halloway, though there was nothing on her that morning to announce it, no title on her coat, no motorcade at the curb, no aide trailing behind her with a folder. Just a woman of 54 in a well-made but unshowy coat, buying a watch for her father's 80th birthday, which was the following Sunday, and which she had been thinking about for 3 weeks. That was the whole of her agenda that day. A watch, wrapped, and then lunch with her sister. It was a Saturday. She was off the bench. She had earned, she thought, a slow morning and a good gift. Denise Halloway had not been born into the kind of life where a person buys a watch like that without thinking. She had been born into the opposite kind. Her mother had cleaned offices at night, downtown, in a building full of law firms whose names Denise would later come to know very well from the other side. Her father had driven a delivery route for a bakery for 31 years, up before the sun, home after dark, his hands always faintly dusted with flour no matter how he scrubbed them. They had raised 4 children in a narrow rented house, and they had raised them on a single unbending idea, repeated so many times it had worn a groove in each of them, that the law was the one thing in this country that was supposed to treat everybody the same, and that if it didn't, then somebody had to make it. Denise had believed that as a girl, the way other children believe in things they have been told by people they love. And then she had grown up and gone out into the world and learned, slowly and painfully, that it was not automatically true, that the law treated people the same only when there were people inside it insisting that it must. So she had decided to be one of those people. She had worked nights the way her mother had to put herself through school. She had gone to a law school that had not expected much from a girl with her background, and had been forced to revise its expectations. She had spent her early years as a public defender, standing next to people who had no one else standing next to them, in courtrooms where the outcome too often seemed decided before anyone sat down. She had learned in those years exactly how it felt to be looked at and sorted and filed before you'd said a single word. Then she had become a prosecutor because she wanted to understand the other side of the machine, then a trial judge, then, 20 years ago, an appellate judge. And then, when the governor had called her name and the state senate had confirmed it, a justice of the state Supreme Court, one of 7 men and women whose signatures at the bottom of an opinion became that day the law of the entire state. 20 years on the bench. 2 decades of reading briefs until her eyes ached, of writing opinions and rewriting them, of sitting on panels that heard the appeals that mattered most. And in recent years, more and more of those appeals had been about one subject in particular, about the encounters between police officers and ordinary people, about what an officer may assume, and when, and on what basis, about the difference between a hunch and a reason, about the exact moment at which a citizen going about their day becomes, in the eyes of the law, a suspect who can be stopped and questioned and detained. She had written some of the most carefully reasoned opinions in the state on precisely that question. Lawyers cited them. Law students read them. Her name sat at the bottom of decisions that told police departments, in measured and unmistakable language, where the line was, none of which was visible on a Saturday morning in a boutique, to a manager who had already made up her mind, which is exactly the point of the whole story. Because the thing Denise Halloway understood, better than almost anyone in the state, was that the law's protections are supposed to apply to you before anyone knows who you are. They're supposed to apply when you're just a woman in a coat buying a watch. If they only kick in once you produce a title, then they aren't protections at all. They're privileges. And Denise Halloway had spent her whole life on the difference between those 2 words. So keep that in mind as we go. Everything Rebecca Stroud was about to do, she was doing to a woman she believed was nobody. That's what makes it matter. Not that she happened to pick the wrong target, though she certainly did, but that she was willing to do it at all, to someone she thought couldn't fight back. Let's go back to the beginning of the morning, before the police, before the card held up between 2 fingers, and watch how quickly a simple purchase turned into something else. Denise had walked into the boutique a little after 10. It was the kind of store that kept the lights low and the music lower, where the watches sat in glass cases like small museum pieces, and there were never more than a handful of customers at a time. She had been in stores like it before, not often, and she knew the particular feeling of them, the way the staff sometimes looked at her a half-second longer than they looked at other people, the way she was sometimes asked, very politely, whether she was looking for anything in particular, in a tone that meant something other than what the words said. She had made a kind of peace with that feeling over the years. Not acceptance exactly, more like a low-grade awareness she carried the way you carry the knowledge of weather. The first person to greet her was not the manager. It was a young saleswoman named Aisha, 22, also black, only 3 months into the job, who had come out from behind the case with a real smile and asked how she could help. And Denise had liked her at once, liked the directness of her, the way she talked about the watches like she actually found them interesting rather than merely expensive. Aisha had shown her 3 or 4 pieces, and Denise had settled on one, a classic thing with a clean face and a brown leather strap, the sort of watch a man who had worn the same cheap one for 40 years would be quietly overwhelmed to receive. It was not cheap. It was, in fact, the most Denise had ever spent on a single gift in her life. But her father was turning 80, and he had driven that bakery route in the dark for 31 years, so that she could stand in a store like this one, and she wanted him to have something beautiful that would outlast them both. "He's going to love it," Aisha had said, wrapping it in her mind already. "Can I get it gift boxed for you?" "Please," Denise had said, and had reached into her bag for her wallet, and had set her platinum card on the little leather tray on the counter. And that should have been the end of it. A card, a machine, a receipt, a box tied with ribbon. 90 seconds and Denise back out on the sidewalk with a gift and a good feeling, and the rest of her Saturday ahead of her. But at that moment, Rebecca Stroud came out of the back. Rebecca Stroud was 43, and she had been the senior manager of that boutique for 6 years, and she ran it, in her own mind, with standards. That was the word she used constantly to the staff. Standards. She meant the fold of a display cloth and the polish of the glass, but she also meant, though she would never have said it aloud in those words, something about who belonged in her store and who did not. She had a very particular idea of the boutique's clientele, an idea she had built out of the customers she was comfortable with, and she policed the edges of that idea with a vigilance she mistook for professionalism. She saw the card on the tray. She saw the price of the watch Aisha was boxing, and she saw the woman standing at the counter, and something in Rebecca Stroud, some ugly and automatic thing she had never once examined, added those three facts together and arrived at a total that was not a sale. It was a crime in progress. She did not think, here is a customer buying an expensive gift. She thought, here is a problem I have caught in time. And she stepped in, smiling the tight professional smile she used when she was about to make someone's day much worse. And she picked the platinum card up off the tray before Aisha could run it, and she said, I'll take care of this one. Aisha, who had been about to complete the easiest sale of her week, hesitated. I've got it, Rebecca. She's all set. I said I'll take care of it, Rebecca repeated, still smiling, and there was enough in her voice that Aisha stepped back. And Rebecca turned the platinum card over in her fingers, slowly, examining it as though it might be printed on the wrong kind of plastic, and she looked up at Denise Halloway with an expression of practiced poisonous courtesy. And she said the first of the things she would spend the rest of her life wishing she could take back. And how did you come to have this card? Denise Halloway had been asked a great many questions in her life, by lawyers and reporters and senators, some of them hostile, most of them at least dressed as respect. She looked at Rebecca Stroud for a moment, and she understood immediately and completely what was happening because she had seen it happen, to herself, to clients, to strangers, more times than she could count. And she felt the old familiar tightening in her chest, the one she had learned long ago never to let reach her face or her voice. It's my card, she said evenly. It's in my name. If you'll run it, you'll see that it's mine. But Rebecca Stroud was not going to run it. That was the strange telling core of the whole thing, the detail that would matter more than any other when people examined it later. She had a card machine 18 inches from her hand. She could have settled the entire question in 4 seconds by doing the one thing her job actually required. And she would not do it, because the answer the machine would give was not the answer she wanted. And on some level, she already knew it. What she wanted was not information. What she wanted was to be proven right about a stranger she had already convicted. So instead of running the card, she set it down on the counter behind the register, out of Denise's reach, and she folded her hands and she said, I'm going to need to see some identification. And I have to tell you, cards like this one are reported stolen all the time. All the time. Aisha, standing to the side, felt her stomach drop, because she had watched Rebecca do versions of this before, to other customers, and she knew where it went. Now, let's slow down here, because I want to be fair to you and lay out plainly what was true, so you can watch the rest of this knowing exactly what these two people did not. The card was not stolen. The card was, in the most boring and verifiable way, exactly what Denise Halloway had said it was, hers, in her name, in perfect standing, with a limit that made the price of the watch a rounding error. If Rebecca Stroud had run it, it would have been approved before she finished exhaling. There was no fraud. There was never, at any point, a single fact pointing toward fraud, other than the one fact that Rebecca Stroud had started with and dressed up as suspicion afterward, the color of the customer's skin. And the woman being asked to prove she hadn't stolen her own credit card was, at that moment, one of the 7 most powerful judicial officers in the state. In her handbag, in a slim leather wallet, next to that platinum card's twin, was her identification, Not a driver's license only, her judicial identification, the card that identified her as Justice Denise Halloway of the state Supreme Court. She could have produced it in 3 seconds and ended the entire scene. She chose at first not to. And I want you to sit with why, because it's the moral center of this whole story. She didn't refuse out of pride exactly, though there was some of that. She refused because she understood something Rebecca Stroud did not. That the question itself was illegitimate. That a paying customer does not owe a store an explanation of how she came to afford what she is buying. That if she flashed a Supreme Court credential and watched Rebecca Stroud dissolve into apology, it would prove nothing except that important people get treated well, which everybody already knows. It would let Rebecca off the hook. It would let her believe her instinct had been reasonable, and she'd simply had the bad luck to aim it at a judge. And Denise Halloway, who had spent 20 years thinking about exactly this, was not interested in teaching Rebecca Stroud that lesson. She was interested in the other one, the one where you treat the woman in front of you as though she has rights before you know she has rank. So she said, again, calmly, "You don't need my life story. You need to run the card. Run it. And if it's declined, I'll leave. If it's approved, I'll take my watch." That's the whole of it. And Rebecca Stroud, feeling the eyes of the store on her now, feeling the small crowd of her own certainty, did the thing that would turn a bad moment into a catastrophe. She reached for the phone by the register, and she said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I'm not comfortable with this. I'm calling the police." Which meant that everything you're about to watch happened not because of a misunderstanding that spun out of control, but because a woman with a card machine at her fingertips chose the police over the 4-second act of doing her job. While the phone rang against Rebecca Stroud's ear, let me tell you about Aisha, because she is not a minor character in this. She is the reason it was allowed to go this far. And she is also, in a quiet way, the person the whole thing was happening to a second time. Aisha had been at the boutique for 3 months. She had needed the job badly, in the way that 22-year-olds 1 semester short of a degree, with rent due and a mother to help, need a job badly. And in 3 months she had learned that working for Rebecca Stroud meant absorbing a steady drip of small instructions that were never quite written down anywhere. Keep an eye on that one. Follow them, but not obviously. We watch certain customers more carefully. You'll get a feel for who. Rebecca had never once said the quiet part in plain words because she didn't have to. The instructions arranged themselves around a pattern, and the pattern was always the same. And Aisha had understood the pattern within her first week and had hated herself, quietly, every time she'd complied with it. Because the customers Rebecca wanted watched looked like Aisha, looked like Aisha's mother, looked, in fact, exactly like the calm woman in the charcoal coat, now standing at the counter being accused of stealing her own card. Aisha had told herself, the way you do when you are 22 and frightened of losing something you need, that she was just doing her job, that she wasn't the one making the rules, that keeping her head down was not the same as agreeing, but she had felt the wrongness of it accumulate, week by week, like water rising in a room, and standing there now, watching Rebecca hold that card out of reach and reach for the phone, Aisha felt the water reach her throat, because this time she could see the whole shape of it clearly. This time, it wasn't a vague, uneasy feeling about a customer being trailed through the store. This time, a woman who had done nothing but buy a gift for her father was about to have the police called on her, and Aisha was standing close enough to stop it, and she didn't know if she was brave enough. "You don't have to do this," Aisha said, low, to Rebecca. "I can just run the card. It'll take a second." "Rebecca, it'll take a second." "Go stand by the door," Rebecca told her, without lowering the phone, in a tone that made it an order and a threat at once. And Aisha, 22 and needing the job, went and stood by the door, but she took her phone out of her apron pocket as she went, and she held it down at her side, and after a moment, with her heart going hard, she started recording. It was the bravest thing she had done in 3 months, and it did not feel brave. It felt like the least she could do, which is how the bravest things usually feel. By now, the 2 other customers had stopped pretending to look at watches. One of them, a woman by the far case, was recording openly. The store's own cameras, mounted discreetly in the corners, were recording as they always did, capturing the whole floor in clean high definition, including the exact moment when Rebecca Stroud, into the phone, said the words that would later be played back to her by people she could not intimidate. "Yes, I'd like to report an attempted fraud in progress. A woman is trying to use a stolen credit card in my store. She's refusing to leave. I have her card. Please send someone. She's refusing to leave." Denise Halloway, who had asked 4 times only that the card be run and who had been told to wait, filed that phrase away with the professional part of her mind, the part that was already, despite everything, taking notes. She was not going to make a scene. She had decided that within the first 30 seconds. She was going to stand exactly where she was, calm and still, and unmistakably reasonable, and let this happen, and let it be recorded happening, because she understood, better, again, than anyone else in that store, how these things looked afterward, and who they usually ended up hurting, and how rarely there was a clean record of what had actually occurred. For once, there would be a record. Several of them. So, she stood, and she waited. And a few minutes later, the bell over the door chimed, and Officer Sean Mabry walked in. Officer Sean Mabry was 35, and he had been on the force for 11 years. And he was, in the way of a great many people who do a difficult job for a long time, running mostly on shortcuts. Not a monster. Not a man who woke up wanting to hurt anyone. Just a man who had learned to read a room fast and act on the reading, and who had stopped noticing, somewhere along the way, how much of his fast reading was built out of assumptions he'd never tested. He came in expecting what the dispatcher had told him to expect. A fraud in progress, a suspect refusing to leave, a store manager who needed backup. That was the frame in his head before his eyes had adjusted to the low light. And the trouble with a frame is that everything you see afterward gets fitted into it. Rebecca Stroud went to him at once, fast, talking before he'd fully cleared the door, and she gave him the story she had built, the story in which she was the vigilant professional who had caught something, and the woman by the counter was the something she'd caught. "That's her," she said. "She tried to buy a $15,000 watch with a card that isn't hers, and when I questioned it, she got aggressive with me, and she won't leave. I have the card right here." And she handed Mabry the platinum card, and Mabry took it. And in that small transfer, the manager handing the officer the customer's card, as though it were already evidence, you could see the whole thing tilt. Because Officer Mabry did the same thing Rebecca had done. He took the story that fit his frame and skipped the 4 seconds of work that would have blown the frame apart. He did not go to the register and run the card. He did not ask Aisha, the saleswoman who had actually been serving the customer, what she'd seen. He turned to Denise Halloway with the card in his hand and the manager's version in his head, and he said in the flat, weary, faintly impatient voice of a man who has decided a thing is simpler than it is, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step outside with me and we'll get this sorted out." Step outside. Away from the cameras, Denise thought. Away from the witnesses. She did not move. "Officer," she said, and her voice was still low and still perfectly even, the voice she used from the bench when she wanted a room to go quiet. "I'm happy to sort this out. It'll take 1 minute. All I've asked from the beginning is that the card be run. It's my card. It will be approved. The manager has refused to run it and has instead accused me of theft in front of these people. I haven't raised my voice. I haven't threatened anyone. I've asked one thing, 4 times. Run the card." "I understand you're saying that," Mabry said, which was the sentence of a man not listening. "But the manager here has made a complaint, and I need you to step outside so we're not doing this in the middle of her store. Let's go." "I'm not going to step outside," Denise said. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm not going anywhere with less light and fewer witnesses. And I'd like your name and badge number, please." And that, to Officer Mabry, sounded like resistance. Not like a reasonable person protecting herself. Not like a citizen asserting a right. Resistance. Because in his frame, she was already the suspect. And a suspect who won't comply is a suspect escalating, and 11 years of shortcuts told him what you do about that. His hand moved toward the cuffs on his belt, and he said, "Okay, I asked you nicely. Turn around for me." The store went very still. Aisha's phone, down at her side, kept recording. The woman by the far case drew in a breath. And Denise Halloway, Justice of the State Supreme Court, felt the cold click of a moment she had read about in 1,000 briefs arriving at last at her own wrists. Here is where I have to stop and make sure you see the size of what was about to happen, because it is easy to let it slide by as just another bad scene in a store. An officer of the law was about to place handcuffs on one of the highest judges in the state, in public, for the crime of buying a watch while black, on the word of a manager who had refused to run a credit card. And every legal question wrapped up in that sentence: when a stop is lawful, when a detention becomes an arrest, what an officer may assume and what he must verify, how much a citizen's calm insistence on her rights may be held against her. Every single one of those questions was a question Denise Halloway had spent 20 years answering in writing, in opinions that this very officer's department was legally bound to follow. The law he was about to break, in other words, she had helped to write. If this is landing with you, if some part of you is bracing the way the store braced, do me a favor and leave a like on this video. It genuinely helps more people find these stories. And stay with me, because the moment everything turned is very close now. She did not turn around. She kept her hands visible, and she kept her voice level, and she said, "Officer Mabry, before you put those on me, I want you to hear one thing, and I want the cameras in this store to hear it too. My name is Denise Halloway. I have identification in my bag. You are about to detain me on the accusation of a woman who has refused 4 separate times to perform the 4-second task of running the card she claims is stolen. I have committed no crime. I have been entirely cooperative, except in declining to leave a well-lit room full of witnesses, which is my right. If you place me in handcuffs now, you will be doing it on this record, and you will answer for it on this record. I am telling you this once, calmly, as a courtesy. Run the card." There was something in the way she said it. Not loud, never loud. But there was 20 years of a courtroom in it, a certainty that did not match anything in Officer Mabry's frame. And for the first time, a small cold doubt opened in the back of his mind. The sense you get when a thing you were sure of turns slightly under your feet. But Rebecca Stroud, who could feel her whole certainty coming apart, could not stand the doubt, and she rushed to fill it. "She's lying," Rebecca said. "They always have a story. Officer, she's been aggressive since she walked in. I want her out of my store." And it was at that precise moment, on that word, that the bell over the door chimed for the 3rd time that morning. And a man walked in whose arrival was about to end Rebecca Stroud's career. The man who walked in was Mr. Alden. He owned the boutique, not just this one, but the small chain of them, 3 stores across 2 cities, built over 30 years from a single counter he'd started with when he was younger than Aisha. He was 70, silver-haired, unhurried, dressed with the quiet care of a man who no longer had anything to prove. He had come in that Saturday for the most ordinary of reasons, to look at the new displays and take the manager to lunch. He had not expected to find a police officer reaching for handcuffs in the middle of his sales floor. He stopped just inside the door and took in the scene. The officer, the cuffs half drawn, the calm woman in the charcoal coat with her hands visible, the 2 customers filming, Aisha frozen by the wall with her phone at her side, Rebecca red-faced and mid-sentence, and Mr. Alden, who had spent 30 years reading rooms full of people deciding whether to spend a great deal of money, read this one in about 2 seconds, and did not like a single thing he read. But it was not the tableau that stopped his heart. It was the woman's face. Because Mr. Alden, unlike everyone else in that store, recognized her. He recognized her because 8 months earlier, he had sat in a hotel ballroom at a bar association dinner. He sponsored a table every year, a habit from his civic-minded father, and he had watched this exact woman receive an award for her service to the state's justice system, and he had listened to her give a short, plain, unforgettable speech about her mother cleaning offices at night, so that her daughter could one day help decide what the law meant. He had gone home and repeated that speech to his wife, and now she was standing at his counter, in his store, being told to turn around and put her hands behind her back. "Stop," Mr. Alden said, not loudly, but everyone stopped. He crossed the floor. He looked at Officer Mabry and at the platinum card in the officer's hand and at Rebecca. And then he turned to the woman in the coat, and he did a thing that rearranged the entire room. He inclined his head slightly with respect, and he said, "Justice Halloway, I'm so terribly sorry. I'm the owner of this store. Please, my God, what has happened here? Justice Halloway." The two words dropped into the silence and detonated without a sound. Officer Mabry's hand came off the cuffs as though the belt had turned hot. Rebecca Stroud's face did something complicated and terrible, the color draining out of it in stages. And Aisha, by the door, felt her breath go out of her in a rush, because she had known this woman was somebody. She had felt it. And here it was. "Justice?" Officer Mabry said, and his voice had lost all of its flat certainty. "I'm sorry. What? Justice of what?" "Of the State Supreme Court," Mr. Alden said, before Denise could answer. And there was a thin edge of something in his old voice now. "Justice Halloway sits on the highest court in this state. She gave the keynote at the Bar Association dinner I attended in the spring, and you have her in the middle of my store being accused of what exactly? Rebecca? Of what?" And now, at last, the 4 seconds of work that everyone had refused to do got done. Mr. Alden held out his hand for the card. Officer Mabry gave it to him. Mr. Alden walked behind the register himself, and he ran the platinum card through the machine, and the machine did what it was always going to do, in less time than it takes to describe. It approved the charge. A green light, a soft chime, a slip of paper curling out with the word "approved" printed plainly on it, for a woman who had told them 5 times, calmly, that this was exactly what would happen. There had never been any fraud. There had never been a stolen card. There had been only a paying customer and a manager who could not believe that a black woman could be one. Mr. Alden tore off the slip and held it up, and he looked at Rebecca Stroud over the top of it, and the look on his face was one Rebecca had never seen there in 6 years and would never forget. "It's approved," he said quietly. "It was always going to be approved. You called the police on a customer, on a justice of the Supreme Court, over a card you refused to run. It would have taken you 4 seconds, Rebecca. 4 seconds at any point in the last 20 minutes. Now, I want to slow this down, because what Denise Halloway did next is the part that matters most, and it is not what most people, in that moment of vindication, would have done. She did not gloat. She did not raise her voice, even now, when raising it would have been so easy and so satisfying. She did not turn to Rebecca Stroud and unload 20 minutes of humiliation back onto her, though God knows she had earned the right. Instead, she became, very visibly, the thing she actually was. She became a judge. She turned first to Officer Mabry and she said, "Officer, your body camera is recording. I want it to keep recording. Don't turn it off. Do you understand me? Leave it on." And Mabry, pale, nodded. Because a man who has just learned that the person he nearly handcuffed writes the law he works under does not turn his camera off when she tells him to leave it on. "Good," she said. "Now I want you to do this correctly, because there is going to be a review of this, and you're going to want a clean record of the end even if the middle is bad. I am Justice Denise Halloway. Here is my identification." And she reached into her bag, unhurried, and drew out the slim leather wallet and opened it and showed him, not to prove she was worthy of being treated like a human being, but to begin, formally, the process of accountability, her judicial credential, her name, her court. Everything that had been in her bag the entire time, 3 seconds from her hand, that she had declined to use as a shield because she had wanted first to see how they would treat a woman with no shield at all. "You'll want to note," she said, and her voice was the voice from the bench now, level and precise and utterly without cruelty, that at no point did you run the card, that the complaint was made by someone who refused to run it, that I asked repeatedly and calmly for the single verification step that would have resolved this, and was refused, and was instead told to step outside, away from these witnesses and these cameras. You'll want all of that in your report, officer, because it will be in mine. Officer Mabry, 35 years old and 11 years on the job, understood in that moment that his afternoon, and possibly a good deal more than his afternoon, had gone badly wrong. "Ma'am," he said, "justice. The complaint came in as a fraud in progress. I was responding to what I was told. I know how it came in," she said, not unkindly. "And I know it's easier to believe the manager than to run the card. That's the whole problem, officer. That's the entire problem in one sentence. And it is the thing I spend my working life on. You didn't need to believe me. You needed to check. The checking was right there." She let that sit for a moment. Then she added quietly, "You'll do better. I actually believe you'll do better. But there's going to be a review, and there should be." And then she turned to Rebecca Stroud. Rebecca had backed against the display case, her arms wrapped around herself, and the certainty that had powered her through the last 20 minutes had drained out completely, leaving something small and frightened in its place. She had, in the space of 2 words from her own boss, understood the magnitude of what she had done, and understood, too, that there was no version of the next few weeks in which she kept her job. She opened her mouth, and what came out was the oldest and worst of the defenses. I was trying to protect the store. Cards like that get stolen. I've seen it. I was doing my job." "No," Denise said, and for the first time there was steel showing through the calm, though her voice never rose. "You weren't doing your job. Your job was to run the card. You did the opposite of your job. You looked at me and you decided, before I'd said a word, what I was, and then you spent 20 minutes trying to make the world agree with you. You wouldn't run the card because you were afraid it would tell you that you were wrong. That's not protecting the store. That's protecting your own certainty about who's allowed to shop here. And I want you to understand something." She stepped just slightly closer. "I am going to be fine. I have a title and an award and an owner who recognize my face. I am the luckiest possible person for you to have done this to, because I can walk out of here and it changes nothing about my life. But there was a young woman in here 3 weeks ago, or 3 months ago, who looked like me and had no title, and you did some smaller version of this to her, and she went home and cried and told no one, because who would believe her? She's the one you actually hurt. She's the one this is for, not me." The store was silent. Aisha by the door was crying, quietly, and had stopped caring who saw. Let's step back out for a moment, because I want to name the thing that makes this story matter beyond one bad morning in one store. The reason Denise Halloway spent her career on those cases, the stops, the searches, the split-second assumptions, was that she understood a truth most people only glimpse. The law does not work by catching every wrong after it happens and punishing it. It works when it works, by shaping what people do before anyone is watching. And the whole design collapses the instant we decide it applies only to people we've already identified as important. Rebecca Stroud did not treat Denise Halloway that way because Denise was a judge. She treated her that way because she thought Denise was nobody. The badge, the pin, the title, those are the things that were supposed to be irrelevant, and in a just world would be, because the woman buying a watch for her father is owed decency as a customer, full stop, whoever she turns out to be. That was Denise's entire life's argument, and Rebecca Stroud had just proven it for her, on camera, better than any opinion she could ever write. Now let's follow what happened after the slip printed approved, because a story like this one doesn't end in the store. It ends in the weeks that come after. Denise Halloway bought the watch. That detail matters to her, so it should matter to us. She was not going to let Rebecca Stroud rob her father of his birthday gift on top of everything else. Mr. Alden rang it up himself, refused to let her pay the tax, tried to refuse to let her pay at all until she gently insisted, and had it boxed and wrapped in the good paper with his own hands while apologizing approximately every 90 seconds. She thanked him. She was gracious to him because he had done the one right thing in a room full of wrong ones. And then she walked out into the Saturday with the gift under her arm, and she sat in her car for a while before she started it, because being calm in a room is a performance that costs something, and the cost comes due afterward in private. She was 54 years old and one of the most powerful jurists in the state, and she sat in a parking garage and let her hands shake for a few minutes because a police officer had reached for handcuffs while she stood there, having done nothing at all. That happened too. That's part of the story. The calm was real, and so was the cost of it. Rebecca Stroud was fired within the week. It was not close, and it was not complicated. Mr. Alden had 30 years and 3 stores and a reputation he was not going to let a manager's bigotry burn down, and he had, moreover, been personally sickened by what he'd walked into. There was security footage from the store's own cameras. There was Aisha's video. There was footage from the customer by the far case. There was the body camera. There was, in short, a mountain of clean, uncontestable record. The very thing Denise had made sure would exist by staying calm and letting it all happen on tape. Rebecca's version, the one about the aggressive customer and the vigilant manager, could not survive 10 seconds of contact with the footage. She was gone, and the reason for her going was documented in a way that would follow her into every future interview in the industry. Because Mr. Alden was not the kind of man to lie on a reference to protect someone who'd done what she'd done. Officer Mabry did not lose his job, but he did not get to keep his Saturday tidy either. Denise Halloway filed a complaint, a careful, factual, unembellished one, the kind of complaint the judge writes, with times and quotes and a clear account of the single failure at the center of it, that no one ran the card. It triggered an internal review. Mabry was retrained, formally counseled, and made to sit through exactly the kind of session that his department's policies, some of them shaped by opinions with Denise Halloway's name at the bottom, required in cases like his. And the strange, almost hopeful footnote is that he seems to have actually heard it. People who knew him said the boutique call changed how he worked, that he became, of all things, the officer at his precinct most likely to slow down, to check the simple thing, to say out loud to a younger partner, run it first before you decide what you're looking at. Denise had told him he'd do better. It appears he did. Not every villain in these stories is beyond reach, and the officer who won't run the card is a different creature from the manager who won't, and it's worth telling the truth about both. And Aisha. Aisha, who had recorded the whole thing with her heart in her throat, who had said, "You don't have to do this," and been sent to stand by the door, who had complied with the small daily wrongness for 3 months and hated herself for it, and then, in the one moment that counted, had quietly done the brave thing. Aisha did not lose her job. Aisha got Rebecca's. Not immediately, and not as some tidy reward handed down like a prize, but Mr. Alden, in the weeks after, sat down with the young woman who had had the courage to press record on her own manager, and he listened to her talk about what it had actually been like to work that floor under those unwritten instructions, and he heard, in her account, everything that had been wrong with his store that he'd been too far from the counter to see. He made her a manager before the year was out, and the first thing Aisha did, the very first policy she set, was the simplest one imaginable, the one that would have prevented the entire catastrophe. You run the card. Whoever they are, whatever they're buying, however they look to you, you run the card and you let the machine tell you the truth, because it is not your job to decide in advance who is allowed to be a customer here. There is a small coda, and I'll give it to you, because it's the kind of thing that's true even when it sounds too neat. Some months later, a case came up through the appellate system and landed, as such cases do, on the desk of the state Supreme Court. A case about a detention in a store, about an officer who had acted on a complaint without verifying it, about the exact line between a lawful stop and an unlawful one. Denise Halloway sat on the panel that heard it. She did not mention the boutique. She did not need to. She simply did what she had done for 20 years, which was to read the record with unusual care and to ask, in her low and precise voice, the question she always asked, the question that turned out to be the whole of her life's work. Did anyone check? Before they decided what this person was, did anyone actually check? So, let me leave you with the thing underneath all of it. Rebecca Stroud looked at a woman and saw a thief because the woman was black and the purchase was large, and she was so certain of what she saw that she called the police rather than spend 4 seconds finding out she was wrong. And the woman she was so certain about turned out to be one of the people in the entire state most qualified to judge exactly what Rebecca had done. That's the irony, and it's a good one, and it's the reason this story travels. But the irony is not the point. The point is the thing Denise said in the store, quiet and steady, with the wrapped watch still waiting on the counter, that she was the luckiest possible person for it to happen to, and that the ones it usually happens to have no title, no award, no owner who knows their face, they just have the long walk to the car and the shaking hands and no one who would believe them. The title should never have been what saved her. That it was is the whole problem. And a world where you have to be a Supreme Court justice to get someone to run your credit card is not a world that has solved anything. It's just a world that occasionally, by accident, points its unfairness at someone big enough to answer back. Denise Halloway gave her father the watch that Sunday. He was 80 years old, a man who had driven a bakery route in the dark for 31 years, so his daughter could grow up to help decide what the law meant. And he turned it over in his flour-worn hands and got quiet for a long moment. And then he asked her, the way fathers do, whether everything was all right, because he could tell, the way fathers can, that something had happened. And she looked at him, and she thought about all of it, and she decided that on his 80th birthday he did not need to carry it. "Everything's fine, Dad," she said. "I just wanted you to have something beautiful," which was true. And which was also, in its own quiet way, the whole reason she had walked into that store to begin with. So, let me ask you what I always ask, because your answers are the best part of doing this. Have you ever been treated like you didn't belong somewhere you had every right to be? Watched, questioned, followed, doubted, for no reason you could name but the obvious one? And what do you think of how Justice Halloway handled it? The choice to stay calm, to let it all happen on camera, to decline to use her title until the very end. Would you have had that kind of patience? I'm not sure I would. Tell me in the comments. I read them, and I learned from them. If this story moved you, do the small things that help it reach the next person. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you're not already here, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that dignity doesn't come with a title, and neither does the right to be believed. Thank you truly for spending this time with me. Take care of yourselves. Be a little braver than you think you are when it counts, and I'll see you in the next one.